Welcome to Law Pod. My name is Alessandro Corda, and in this episode, Teresa Degenhardt and I will be interviewing Professor Máximo Sozzo, the distinguished speaker for the 2025 annual lecture of the Institute of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Queen's University, Belfast. He is Professor of Sociology and Criminology and Director of the Crime and Society Program at the National University of Litoral in Santa Fe, Argentina, and is currently Leverhulme Visiting Professor at the University of Edinburgh. He has published extensively on the sociology of punishment and prison studies in Spanish, English, Italian, and Portuguese, and is the author of countless articles and many books and book chapters. Let me mention just three of his works in light of this conversation. Máximo is co-author of Southern Criminology, published by Routledge in 2019, and co-editor of the Palgrave Handbook of Criminology and the Global South, published again by Palgrave in 2018, and more recently, Decolonising the Criminal Question, Colonial Legacies, Contemporary Problems, published by OUP in 2023. Máximo, welcome. I would like to start with a question about your background, your education. So how did you become interested in the field of criminology and in the field of the sociology of punishment, since you are a lawyer?
Well, at the beginning of the 1990s, in the context of the transition to democracy in Argentina, many law schools have been in a process of change. We were in some way leaving behind the past of the military dictatorship. New views, new debates were introduced in the law school. Traditionally, criminology in Latin America in general and in Argentina in particular was strongly connected with the field of law, with the world of law, particularly with, of course, criminal law professors. So when I was very, very young, I had a very interesting criminal law professor who introduced me to many things of the discussions of the so-called, in that moment, critical criminology in Latin America and in Europe. So I established a connection with people working in the field of the social sciences, particularly in the field of sociology. And I started to educate myself in a very informal way with these people that were the people who founded a very important journal in the Spanish-speaking world, that is Delito y Sociedad, Crime and Society. It's a journal that has been founded in 1992, and I am now the editor-in-chief of that journal. So we work a lot around that journal, and I introduced myself in that community that was strongly connected, as I said, with the world of sociology. So I did an MA in the University of Buenos Aires in the Faculty of Social Sciences, and since then, since the 1990s, I developed my academic trajectory in connection with this field of criminology, always with one foot in the world of law and one foot in the world of sociology.
Thank you. So you have a very complex trajectory in terms of studies, research, and dialogues, not just in between discipline, as you were just explaining, but also in relation to your traveling, not like the criminal question, but your effective travel in between South America and Europe. Do you want to talk a little bit about your traveling?
Yes, because it's really an important part of my trajectory and the way I do things in this field of criminology. Well, and also because it's strongly connected with the context of Italy. And since both of you are Italians of origin, I think it's an interesting thing. I met Massimo Pavarini, a very important critical criminologist at the beginning of the 1990s in Argentina. I was very, very young and an important professor of that field of sociology of deviance, sociology of social control in the University of Buenos Aires. Juan Pegoraro asked me to translate Máximo while he was doing a postgraduate course at the University of Buenos Aires. So I spent with him 3 weeks translating him. So we built there a relationship. Then I went back many times to Bologna to visit him and stay there for many months. Then I met Professor Dario Melosi when he came back from the US to Italy, and I also built a strong relationship with him. So with both Massimo and Dario, have been a very, very important figures in the process of my education, even if they have never been, formally speaking, tutors of a PhD or an MA dissertation, have influenced me quite a lot. So starting with that experience already in the 1990s, I have spent a lot of time in other places, and I travel quite a lot. I enjoy doing it a lot. I think it's a way of, rethinking what you take for granted in your own context, and enable to learn many different things, many different ways of thinking about the criminal question. So after that series of experiences in the Italian context, I also developed another important moment of my trajectory in the US. I was a fellow at the Law School of the University of New York at the beginning of the 2010s. And since then, I spent quite a lot of time in the UK, particularly in Scotland, in Edinburgh, in the last years. So all these experiences were really, really important for me, and are very much part of how I do things and how I think about my research projects.
Thank you, Maximo. You really embody what a global criminologist is, but I would like to go back to your country, Argentina, which is a very interesting country when it comes to the development of penal policies and the sociology of punishment. I was preparing for this podcast, and I checked that in 1908, Argentina had the 7th highest per capita income in the world. But then, since the end of World War II, the country went through various political and economic shifts, from authoritarian regimes to military dictatorship, to more recently democracy, and then lately extreme neoliberal reforms. So can you talk a little bit about the trajectory of Argentina in terms of political economy, politics, but also, of course, penal policies, and to what extent these transformations have influenced the country's penal policies, and what continuities and ruptures do you see in Argentina's approach to punishment over time?
Well, first I would like to make a brief comment about this label of global criminologist. I think of myself as a person that is strongly attached to his own place, that in my case is Argentina. So there is a famous line in a song of what we called in Spanish rock nacional, national rock music of the 1990s, that says, "I love to go out, but I also love to come back." So I am quite embedded in my own context. So going back to your very interesting question and very difficult one, I would rather say that, Argentina, as many other Latin American countries that have experienced authoritarian regimes throughout the 20th century, has begun in the 1980s a process of change, of political change, that has strong promises. And the promises of democratization were very, very ambitious. And these promises have in some way been translated only very partially in transformations of policies, institutions, and practices of state agencies. And this is something that has happened more generally, and in particularly in the penal field. So if we think of different kind of topics, but for example, police institutions and practices, Argentina, as many other Latin American countries, have had a long tradition of militarized police institutions and practices with high levels of authoritarian rationality, with high levels of authoritarian practices. And the process of transition to democracy, of course, implied the very difficult project of trying to transform this. So we have had many different reforms of the police in the name of democracy, particularly since the 1990s onwards. We have many police forces because Argentina is a federal state, so we have 23 different provincial police forces, and then we have 3 different federal police forces. So we have had many attempts to do this, but it's quite clear that the changes that has effectively happened have been very limited in terms of these ambitious promises with which these different kind of processes started. So I think that you can say more or less exactly the same thing in relation to the other state institutions connected with the penal question, with the courts or with the prisons. We have had these attempts to produce democratization and the strong persistence of a core of ways of thinking and ways of acting by state agents that have a lot of elements coming from the authoritarian past. So I think that in a way we are still navigating, after 40 years of democracy, these promises and the shortcomings of its realization. And on top of this, as many other societies have experienced, in the 1990s in Argentina, just 10 years after the beginning of the transition to democracy, crime and punishment became a central object of the public and political debate. And this has in some way been translated in a huge change in terms of how professional politicians relate with crime and punishment. There has been a huge process of politicization of crime and punishment. Crime and punishment enter into the agenda of politicians competing between each other in the game of the really existent democratic regime. And this process of politicization has introduced, as in other places before Argentina even, I am thinking on the United States of America since the 1960s, a strong punitive term that has produced huge amount of effects, particularly during the end of the 1990s and the beginning of 2000s. So the incarceration rate in Argentina went from 62 inmates per 100,000 inhabitants in 1992. I mean, an incarceration rate that was lower than the one of Sweden that year, just to mention an Scandinavian country with all their tradition and their image of being moderate in the penal field, to an incarceration rate of 130 only 10 years later. So 100% of increase of the incarceration rate in a decade. Then we have had a very important experience, recent experience, again, as other Latin American countries, of the construction of a political alliance and program that tried to break with the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, particularly in relation to the economic and social policies connected with neoliberalism, what we call, because we lack another concept, post-neoliberal political processes. But these processes didn't break with this dynamic of being tough on crime completely. So that's why today our incarceration rate is 240 per 100,000 inhabitants.
That's incredible.
So 4 times more than at the beginning of the 1990s.
So one question I have, you are certainly one of the leading figures in the movement to southernize criminology or decolonize criminology. Can I ask you, why do we need to southernize criminology?
Mm-hmm. Very good question, also very difficult one. I have been writing with other people, friends and colleagues in the last 10 years about this need to, in some way, break with a way of thinking how to do research in criminology that in some way do not question the limitations of concepts and arguments that have been created in the central context at the global scale. So English-speaking context like the US or the UK. We have been for many decades just reproducing these theoretical concepts and arguments and using them to interpret our own realities in the global peripheries, in the global south, if we want to call it like this. And we think that we need to interrupt this kind of trajectory with a huge level of inequality, subordination, and dependence between knowledge producers of the north or the center and knowledge producers of the south or the peripheries. But to do this, that is a very, of course, very important scientific and political project. We need to do more than just say that to do this is necessary. So we need to actually translate, again, another promise into our own practices. And I think that the best provisional, let's say, way of trying to do this, I mean, I am open to learn other ways of doing it, but I think that the best way for now to do this is departing from a strong encounter with our own empirical moment in our own southern or peripheral context. I mean, really producing deep descriptions, thick descriptions of our past and our present. And to do this, of course, we need to work a lot. We need to work collectively. It's something that could not be done by one single researcher. We need a community of researchers doing these kind of things. And we need to provincialize metropolitan thinking in our own heads. I have been educated in a tradition of learning everything that the very important authors of the Global North has produced. So I have read everything that Michel Foucault has written in his entire life. I mean, everything, literally, even things that topics or themes that were not particularly interesting for me, like the Iranian Revolution or the practices of confession in the Catholic Church in the first centuries of this post-Christ era. But I think that this was, of course, a very important thing in terms of my education, but at the same time was reproducing, installing this way of thinking, reading from the center. So for many years, I myself, as many other young scholars in Latin America, were, looking in our own realities, what matches arguments and concepts from Foucault. So our texts were like, a piece of reality and a quotation for Foucault, a piece of reality and a quotation for Foucault. So I am bringing these autobiographical elements to say that it's really a difficult task to provincialize metropolitan thinking because it's so embedded in our own intellectual trajectories. So I think that, producing this immersion in our own context is the only antidote. But of course, we need to produce this kind of immersion, being open to activate a more inductive way of thinking about our own problems. That's why, for example, going back to the question that was posed before by Alessandro, thinking about post-neoliberalism in Latin American countries is a very, very important element that probably do not make a lot of sense in the UK, considering the trajectories of the UK governments in the last 4 decades. But for us, it's a huge topic. These political alliances and programs that try to break with neoliberalism has been developed in Latin American countries since the 1970s till the 1990s, have produced a huge political change that have produced different kind of effects. And so in order to understand this, we can not probably do this exactly with the same tools that you are thinking about penal policy in the UK or the US in the last 4 decades.
So you've moved from, or it seems to me that you've published work under the label of Southernizing Criminology, but also under Decolonial Criminology. And there is a proliferation of coloniality, post-coloniality, colonialism, imperialism. Can you tell us, can you help us maybe map out what these different terms mean, maybe in your work, in your trajectory first and foremost, or if you want, even expand on these terms?
Yes. As you know, there has been a huge amount of papers and books that have been published in the last 10 years in the field of criminology around these concepts, decolonizing, southernizing. And in many occasions, the different authors are trying to build a focus on the differences of the different versions of these kind of projects. I am more on the side of finding the commonalities around these different projects. So that's why I think that we need to strengthen these commonalities in order to rethink how we do criminology, both at the centers and at the peripheries. So just to give you an example, I have been quite a lot interested in how power relations are constructed in everyday life inside prisons in Latin America, particularly in Argentina, the place where I have been doing field work, but also in other countries, following the work done by other colleagues and discussing with them. So there is a huge debate in Latin American prison studies about concepts like self-governance or co-governance in order to, in some way, highlight the practices by prisoners themselves to govern other prisoners. These are schemes that have a huge level of variation, that present very, very different characteristics in different settings, in different contexts. All this debate has been constructed from a very, very important immersion inside prison life by researchers using different kinds of techniques of the social sciences, from ethnography to more traditional interviewing inside prisons. And I think that when we think about the peculiarities of these power relations in Latin American prisons, the connection with the legacies of coloniality are not probably the main element in order to understand these dynamics. But you need to decolonize the way you think power inside prisons in order to understand well what is going on in those prisons. So I think that the topic of coloniality, it's a topic that could be more present in some of our exercises in the peripheries, in the South, to understand what is going on, more than in others. So just to give you another example, and sorry for the length of my answers, but I have been also interested in the importation of plea bargaining, nothing to do with prisons and power relations, the importation of plea bargaining inside criminal justice systems in Latin America. And I have been doing a lot of research with prosecutors, public defenders, judges on this. And this is a topic in which, of course, the element of neocoloniality is really, really important. We are talking about the introduction of a practice that came from the US tradition of criminal justice inside Latin America. But and the power relations at a global scale, the differences between the different regions, the exercise of power by different kind of US federal agents in trying to mold how the new criminal justice is working in Latin America after a process of reform since the 1980s is very, very important. So there I found the connection with coloniality much more clear, evident, and immediate. So these examples that I am very briefly presenting, I am trying to show that in some occasions, southernizing the debate of criminology could not imply directly taking colonialism as at the center of the debate, but always it will be, of course, in the general, let's say, background of these activities. So I think that that in that sense, I am trying, although I have been a bit tired in the last years, of trying to promote these commonalities, and particularly, I think that we need to do what we promised in many texts. Criminology will not be southernized or decolonized, just saying that criminology has to be decolonized and southernized. We already have done this. So we need to, in specific topics, in specific themes, show how this decolonizing and southernizing could be translated effectively in understanding better the world and in, if we are lucky enough, giving us more tools in order to transform that world.
Fuori dalla registrazione. So, Máximo, for our listeners, there has been this wide published scholarship on southernizing and decolonizing criminology and different definitions. So some define southernizing as broadening the scope and the focus of criminology, while others say that decolonizing goes a few steps further because the project of decolonizing challenges the very structure of knowledge production. So in a way, takes Southernizing to the next level. You have been talking about this project of finding commonalities between the two, but how comfortable are you with these two definitions, or what are your definitions of the two terms?
I think that the way you put it is quite interesting in order to precisely say that when we have been discussing about Southernizing criminology about a decade ago, and we published a couple of texts on this, we never thought that Southernizing is something that you could do without decolonizing. So it's the two things goes together. So, and in order to Southernize criminology, you need to put colonialism in the center of the agenda. Both colonialism in how we think about the criminal question, but also colonialism in relation to institutions, policies, and practices of crime control. So I do not think that the agenda of Southernizing was simply saying we need to enlarge our debate. I think I in this definition, I connect more this kind of definition to ideas about internationalizing criminology, even producing a global criminology. I imagine this as, we have to enlarge the scope of our topics, but also we have to enlarge the regions of the world that we get into dialogue. Now, we were saying at that moment that, this was, of course, things that has to be done, but at the same time, you have to rethink radically how you produce knowledge in order to identify the relations of inequality, subordination, and dependence, and trying to then deconstruct them. And in order to do this, colonialism is an element that is at the center of the room. So it's impossible not to see the connection from my perspective. And that's why I am so in favor of, beyond all these definitional debates, I have also problems with this need to produce these kind of identities, like Southern criminology, decolonial criminology, and defining yourself as Southern criminologist, decolonial criminologist. For me, all those kind of ideas belong to the, let's say, the big family of the critical tradition of thinking about the criminal question. New iterations, new ways of, and that's why also I am very, very fond of trying also to do a history of this thinking, because if not, we can think that, that all these debates have been only produced when we enter into the room. I mean, and several of these discussions are part of the critical tradition since the 1970s and 80s. And I, coming from Latin America, for me, this is self-evident, When I read Raúl Zaffaroni, Lola Nizar de Castro, Rosa del Olmo at the beginning of the 1990s, I was reading a lot of people who were precisely producing this kind of debate already in that moment.
I would like to go back to what you said about being a global criminologist who also feels very much embedded and comfortable doing work at home. I think that this is a way that many people think using the terms glocal scholars. And speaking of that, we were talking about your work in Argentina and then your more global work. But how about, again, the cluster Argentina is part of, Latin America? So we know that the comparative and global criminological debates are focused on the rise of punitiveness. And you mentioned that Argentina was not exempt from that. But what happened if we look at, assuming that they can be identified, if we look at trends in Latin America over the past, say, 4 decades? Do trends in the rise of punitiveness challenge or complicate the traditional narrative from Western countries in terms of what happened, let's say from the late 80s up to the 2000 and onwards.
Very interesting point. I would first say that Latin America is a very complex region with many differences across their national contexts. And so it's very difficult to do generalizations. And it's important that we maintain our awareness of this all the time in order not to just reify something called Latin America that do not exist. So in relation to the trends towards increasing punitiveness, if you compare the incarceration rates, we all know that the incarceration rates are not the best or the only way of thinking about punitiveness, but it's the only one available easily for this group of countries. If we take the 18 countries that we usually think as part of Latin America together, and we look at the incarceration rates in the beginning of the 1990s, in a moment in which many of these countries were experiencing a process of transition to democracy, like Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, Chile, etc., but also many of them were experiencing peace after very, very cruel civil wars. So the incarceration rates in that moment were quite low. There were only a few countries with more 100 prisoners per 100,000 inhabitants. And there were countries with Scandinavian rates. So when we look at the picture today, the landscape is completely different. There is no a single country with less than 150 prisoners per 100,000 inhabitants. The only example is Guatemala. And we have countries with more than 300 prisoners per 100,000 inhabitants. And we have now the country that incarcerates more in the world, that is El Salvador, with 1,086 prisoners per 100,000 inhabitants. So there is, of course, a huge process of increase of punitiveness in all our countries. But at the same time, the moments of this increase and the degree of this increase is not exactly similar across the countries. So I have been working in a new paper that is under review on the case of Chile. That is a very important case in Latin America because it's probably the example par excellence of the adoption of neoliberal economic and social policies since the military dictatorship in the 1970s. And it's a country that many global north countries recognized as developed in Latin America. So when you look at the incarceration rate today and the incarceration rate at the end of the dictatorship in 1990 in Chile, the increase is quite small because the incarceration rate in 1990 in Chile was the highest one in Latin America. So the incarceration rate growth less than 50% in Chile across these 4 decades. That for Latin American standards is quite moderate level of growth. So, but if you look at the case in more detail, you will learn that in the last 10 years, between 2010 and 2020, in that decade, the incarceration rate in Chile fell by almost 40%. It's the only context in Latin America in which you can see a decrease of the incarceration rate that is really, really important. I mean, 36% of decrease in only a decade. And it was completely against the currents or trends in other Latin American countries. So I just bring in this example in order to be very cautious about generalizations. So the complex dynamic that have produced that decrease in Chile have proved not being long-lasting because, and again, in a very paradoxical dynamic, during the last years after the pandemic of COVID-19 in Chile, the incarceration rate growth again very rapidly. And now Chile has the same incarceration rate as in 2010. All this has happened with the first left-wing government, clearly left-wing government that has been in Chile since the transition of democracy, the government of President Boric. So it's a fantastic case in which you can see many things. First, that not what happens in Latin America is always exactly the same. Second, that there is a huge level of volatility in Latin America around punitiveness. And I am very interested now on understanding particularly the moments of decrease of punitiveness. Because Chile is not the only case. There were moments of decrease of punitiveness in Venezuela, in Ecuador, in Argentina, in different moments in these last 4 decades. And I think that understanding why this has happened is a very important thing. First, from a scientific point of view, but also politically speaking, what were the elements at play that allowed that, at least for some moment, incarceration rates in a context like Latin American contexts, so profoundly marked by the increase of punitiveness, have been stopped or even reversed, even if this has not proved to be effective towards our present.
Thank you very much. This is truly interesting because, as we know, criminologists, lawyers doing comparative work, they love to develop taxonomies, typologies. And in the case of Latin America, there was by some this idea of being able to kind of capture and kind of crystallize the pink tide, for example, and speak about Latin American as a cluster, when then, as you rightly and compellingly pointed out, we need to look at nuances, at differences, and the dynamic evolutions, which are very much nation-based. So thank you so much for this strong case in terms of the importance of always complicating the picture, even though scholars are often tempted to crystallize typologies and offer this kind of static models.
If I can add something, is something that it's also useful in the global north. I mean, because we have context in Europe that have experienced in the last 10, 15 years important levels of decrease of the incarceration rate. So some Eastern European countries have experienced decreases of the incarceration rate that are really, really important. And we have been discussing all the time in the last 40 years in punishment and society studies about the forces that produce the increase of punitiveness. And I think that, looking at the work by different authors, I'm thinking, for example, of the work by Gavin Slade on Kazakhstan and other ex-Soviet republics around the decrease of the incarceration rate, or I'm thinking on the work of José Ángel Brandaris about the decrease of the incarceration rate in Spain, could, in some way be interesting in trying to bring this topic more towards to the center of our discussion in punishment and society studies.
And that seems to bring to the globalist as well. So there's one more question. I would like to move on to the state of academia today. And certainly here we are experiencing a sort of a crisis of academic institutions. Student fees are extraordinary. Many students have to pick up a loan and go into debt to pursue their academic trajectories. We are faced with the development of artificial intelligence and the decrease in funding. The university is increasingly run as markets through financialization and marketization. I wonder, what does it mean to produce knowledge in this context from Argentina? And if you can tell us a little bit about that, what is the state of academia in Argentina and what does it mean to produce knowledge in a context of authoritarianism or a change of, often a constant change of regime?
I think that the answer to this question could be very, very large. I will try to do my best to keep it short. First, in Argentina, students do not pay if they go to the public universities to do their undergraduate programs. The only fees that you have to pay is for doing graduate programs, and the fees are quite moderate, even if they have been increased in the last years. So we have this long-standing tradition since the transition to democracy, a very interesting and important one of having public universities that are open to everybody. Of course, inequalities, economic and social inequalities are active, and many people could not access to the university, even if you don't need money in order to study inside of the university. The other side of the same coin is that traditionally professors and researchers in Argentina are very badly paid. So when I started my academic career, I used to teach in 3 different universities in the 1990s. So it was impossible to survive with one salary of one university. This has changed a bit in the 2000s and the beginning of 2010, particularly in that wave of post-neoliberal governments that we had. We, at the end, were able to survive with our own salaries, working for one single university. We are now experiencing a huge attack on public universities by this new federal government that started in December 2023. That is a radical version of neoliberalism plus neoconservatism, a radical version of the new right that has, of course, many authoritarian tones in many different areas, and particularly in the case of public universities, our budget has been cut severely. I mean, when I am saying severely, I am saying severely, very, very strong cut. We lost half of our budget last year. So this has impacted in, for example, the salaries of the professors. We lived in the last 5-10 years in an economy with a huge level of inflation. This problem of inflation has been increasing in the last years, and particularly in 2023 has experienced a huge increase. After a devaluation produced by this new federal government, this problem has been even stronger during 2024. So since professors were paid exactly the same salaries as in 2023, we lost around between 35 and 45% of our salaries, depending on who do the calculation. So we are really experiencing a very, very difficult situation. The government, the federal government, has cut all the money for doing research. So, for example, I won a project in 2023 that is the most ambitious project with public funding in my country, and the government didn't give me the money to do the research, and they didn't give me any explanation about it. They just didn't give me the money, and they didn't say publicly if they will give the money in a future moment or not. What has happened with that competition? That is, a national competition, very serious, very difficult funding to obtain, but we are in the middle of uncertainty in that sense. So today, to do research on the criminal question from a critical standpoint in my country is really, really hard. Not probably because we are experiencing processes of political persecution like has happened recently in other places of Latin America. For example, in Brazil, during Bolsonaro government, we could not say that this is happening in that way. But in terms of the absence of resources, it's very difficult. So it is producing a huge impact in the younger generations, like has happened in the golden age of the neoliberal reforms at the beginning of the 1990s. They are thinking that the only solution for pursuing an academic career is through the airport, going abroad and do a career in other places. So we are really, really in a very difficult situation, but we have been fighting a lot. I mean, we did a lot of strikes during 2024. We did 2 public demonstrations that were massive. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people in the streets fighting for public university. And I think that we will continue to do it during 2025. And in general, the levels of resistance are quite strong. So I am not trying to be an optimistic. I am not trying to present an ingenuously optimistic stance, but I really think that we are many and we are able to produce change through collective mobilization. So this is what we are doing today.
Great, thank you. Thank you for this. I think it's a very important
Yes,
topic today.
Maximo, one last question. So you've been working now, as you mentioned, for the past 10 years on Southernizing, decolonizing. You're still very, very active, a leading voice really in the space. But what are your next projects? What's on your map moving forward?
Well, as I said before, I think that all these promises have to be translated in our own research, doing research on specific topics. So I have been doing different things in the last years that are strongly connected with doing empirical research in our own context in Latin America. I am writing a book on penal metamorphosis in Argentina since the transition to democracy till our present. That is a very ambitious project that I have been carrying out for many years now, trying to in some way build an explanation of what has happened in Argentina during the last 40 years with the penal field. So I am expecting to finish this book this year if I am lucky enough. So this is a very important project for me. In parallel with this, I am developing another very important project with colleagues from Spain and Canada. There is a comparative project on prison transparency, how we produce information about what is going on inside prisons in the public realm, in the political realm. We have been doing a lot of empirical research in Argentina about what I labeled in a recent text that is about to be published, contested practices of transparency, practices of transparency against prison administration. So we are looking at practices of state agents like public defenders or oversight mechanisms like the National Committee for the Prevention of Torture or a sort of ombudsman that is in charge of protecting the rights of prisoners in Argentina. But we are also doing research on public universities that do programs inside prisons and social organizations from feminist to artistic organizations who do things inside prisons as how they build these practices of producing transparency. So I am working both in the empirical side of this, but also in thinking about the concept of transparency, how we can build this alternative vision in comparison with what happens in many global north countries in which prison services proclaim transparency as a value, and they translate this in practices of official transparency, as I would like to label, that conceal at the same time as show. So we are thinking of this kind of practices of transparency that in many occasions are created from below, from prisoners themselves and many external actors, both state and non-state actors. So we are thinking on concepts like counterveillance, for example, as way of thinking about these alternative ways of producing transparency. So these are my main projects today.
Fantastic. We truly look forward to your forthcoming work. We've come to the end of this episode of Law Pod. Thank you very much, Teresa. And above all, Máximo, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Teresa and Alessandro.